Welcome back everyone to Random's Thoughts, bringing you another deck that carried me from Bronze to Diamond in Runestrike. This time around, we're channeling Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, so to speak. We have lions, tigers, and bears coming from all angles, as well as a variety of other beasts. That's right, in fact, it's a keeper beast list, so let's jump into it. How many beasts would Keeper keep if Keeper could keep beasts? Well, we'll get into that, but as always, we want to in fact start with the champion. Now, this champion seems to differ, at least in my opinion, from some of the ones that I talked about previously, where many of them could get by with simply their A1 or their A2, and kind of every once in a blue moon would leverage their A3. I think Keeper really needs the A3 in order to compete. Now, why is that? Well, we'll start at the beginning. The first up is Soul Spore. Soul Spores is target minion loses -1/-1, and at the end of its turn, it loses an additional -1/-1. Realistically, this was utilized early on in the grind to Diamond, and generally you can't rely on the second half. You have to assume that you can only get the first half to go off. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and sometimes you have to take that chance. It's all you have available. But realistically, if the opponent doesn't provide a 1 health target to hit with Soul Spores, or something that you can make 1 health either due to Twister or because of combat or something like that, you don't really want to be reaching for A1. In all honesty, due to the recent rework, I actually preferred the old version of Keeper's A1, where it would deal more damage and you'd heal a little bit. The lack of healing does come up, but ultimately this is probably for the better in the grand scheme of things. It just kind of hurts when you're trying to make a run with Keeper. Now, next up is Spawn Creeper. Spawn Creeper is, again, a rework on Keeper from the previous. The old one used to provide an abomination, you know, that 3/5 for 4 that counts as all the various different minion types. Well, now you get a Noxious Creeper. What's a Noxious Creeper, you ask? Well, you may have noticed the screen shift here a little bit. This is a Noxious Creeper. It's a 3/2 for 3, well, 3 blood, really, with a berry that the opposing minion gains suffer 2 and berry deal 1 to adjacent minions. Now, honestly, I think this is cool. I think it's very thematic. I think it's a fun ability. Realistically, I'm not getting a whole lot of use out of it. Similar to the A1, you're relying on your opponent making an error. So I picture this getting more value when there are sacrifice outlets, ways for Keeper to destroy his own minions for value. So it's, I summon the creeper, I do this thing, and then I give your guy suffer as well as this berry effect. Now, there are some already that exist in Shadow, but I'm not sure if there's quite enough yet. But it can certainly provide value. It obviously puts a body on the board, so maybe you can pressure, it blocks, it'll eventually be removal. It's definitely valuable. I'm just not quite as excited about it. Now, shifting back to our deck view, we actually want to focus on A3, which is Death Harvest. Sounds cool, right? Real dramatic, very 90s edgy, right? Destroy target minion, a random adjacent minion gains its attack. Now, notably, this does not have to target your opponent's stuff. Obviously, you need to be careful that your opponent hasn't flooded the board and all of a sudden, oops, I made like a 15 attack minion. My bad. You're gonna learn your lesson quickly if you do that. But you can also target your own minions to try and kind of sort of make an evasive minion. Oh, they decided to block this guy? Well, guess what? It just slides on over to one of the options. And because, you know, you can control the placement of your minions, you could or should be able to ensure where this is going, including even on your opponent's side for the most part. It takes a little bit of effort. But what I found is that if you save up your blood and utilize Death Harvest as a tempo removal, every few turns, you're going to pop their best minion. And against certain decks, you can kind of feel it out even ahead of time when certain threats are coming down. It's an Emrys deck. Okay, well, if I expect there are going to be Raptors or a Great Elk or something that I really don't want to stick around, I'm not going to waste time on A1 and A2. I'm just going to bank up for A3 and then pop that thing so that way I don't have to invest like 5 cards in order to remove it or before it spins out of control. Oh, they played one of the new constructs. That thing has a big set of health. Death Harvest kind of doesn't care, and guess what? They have 0 attack, so no buff for you. There are a number of different ways that I found Death Harvest to be really important, a number of matchups, and it kind of got things to snowball at that point. Once I unlocked it, I was able to score and accrue way more wins than I think I would have if I simply tried to push everything through with just A1 and A2. So that's a quick overview of the abilities. Let's jump into the cards themselves. As with many of the other lists that I've talked about, this is somewhat budget. There's definitely things that are missing that are probably going to stand out immediately, such as Diana or Beast Clan Laird. And when I say stand out, I mean their lack thereof. There's only so much you can do when you have a limited collection, but it was definitely fun to play this, and I'll talk about the different things, what could get added, what needs more copies, etc. as we go through it. Off the top, Blitz package, it's there, or at least part of it. We're not running Mastodons, which notably are beasts, but of course, Iron Bull itself is a beast as well. So we'll put them aside. Everybody's probably tired of hearing about those. Let's talk instead about Duskbolt. Duskbolt does exactly what you kind of expect it to do. It helps you shore up your early game, and it allows you to hit certain breakpoints with other stuff. They have a 6 health minion? Alright, Sickle Stalker plus Duskbolt. Or Twister plus Duskbolt, that sort of thing. It allows you to score eliminations on opposing minions that you wouldn't otherwise. But of note, its target enemy. You can aim this at your opponent's face. Keep that in mind. Is this really necessary? I'm not sure. I expected this to actually do much better against aggro than I thought it would, but the number of Agma aggro lists that I encountered, which were... It's tough to call them aggro because they didn't really start applying pressure until turn 5, 6, 7, but the pressure came pretty heavily. So it's tough to judge because obviously Duskbolt doesn't do a whole hell of a lot against, say, Mindless Raider. It might. Again, Desert Twister or Sickle Stalker allows it to now get removed, and it heals a little bit, but these slots could be something else. Next up is something that I would not recommend cutting, and that's Owl Familiar. Aside from being a beast and being on theme, it's also incredible. We talked about this on length, or at length on stream. This is one of the best cards in the game to me. It will almost always be draw 2 cards, and it's going to force something out of your opponent. Now, ultimately, that could just simply be the 2-drop, such as Crazed Alchemist or whatever that they were going to play anyway, but it does allow you to potentially remove said threat, whatever they actually play to the board, and keep your owl online. It, at the very worst, will replace itself because, oh, I have 8 cards in hand. I play it. It draws a card. Granted, you don't really want to do that when you have 8 because then you're not drawing a card on your turn, but Owl Familiar is spectacular. Next up is a card that I didn't get a chance to play with until this list, and I haven't really seen from other players in Pagan Harvest. Now, I could see this going down to a single copy, but this card was crucial for a number of wins that helped propel me into Diamond. Why? Sometimes at the end of the game, you just have things such as the owl, and you're almost out of cards, or you're full on hand size, which this also helps out with, by the way. Or you have some other low drops that maybe you picked up off of Island Turtle or one of the Amazons or something along those lines. Ultimately, you tend to have some kind of fodder to feed into it is the point. And since we're leaning into beasts, it's often a beast. Remember when I was talking about A3 being real important? Here's a big reason why that you were able to pull that. That card up there allows you to power into immediately in A3. Even if you just did it last turn, you get a blood at the start of your turn, you play Pagan Harvest, if you pitch a beast, you get 3, guess what? That's 4, and kapow, you've eliminated your opponent's really powerful minion or threatening minion, or cleared a blocker so you can keep pressuring. Pagan Harvest allowed me to make a lot of plays that I wouldn't have ordinarily been able to, simply because you had to wait so long. It's blood generation out of light, or outside of the light realm, which makes it very unique. And I like this card a lot. Plus, since, as you'll see, we have a number of cards that either draw cards or add cards back to our hand via Conjure, so this allows you to kind of get rid of some things that you may not necessarily need in order to ensure that you can keep finding other gas. I really like Pagan Harvest. I say maybe go down to 1 simply because, it's a 2 for 0, sort of 2 for 1 in the wrong direction, and you need to have the fuel for it. It can be a little clunky. It's not a great top deck when you have no cards in hand, for example. So next up is Swamp Scout. I'm torn between Swamp Scout and Beast Mistress, who kind of fit the same category alongside Island Turtle, that aforementioned card draw conjure. The sets of Owl, the Scout, the Turtle, and then adding Beast Mistress on top means that you generally will have fodder for the aforementioned Pagan Harvest, but sometimes you run into that weird scenario where my board is mostly full or totally full. I have a ton of cards in hand. I can't play anything out. I just have these weird clunky turns. I can't quite do it. But Swamp Scout's important because it fills in the low end of the curve and gives you the option to fill out holes in your curve, gaps that could happen later on without having to take up an entire turn. You could, late in the game, play a Swamp Scout, get a cool beast, and slam it on the same turn. Definitely very strong. Obviously, some beasts are better than others, but even the weaker ones, if you conjure them, they weren't wasting space in your deck. So it's still pretty decent most of the time. I really like Swamp Scout. Next up is Bloodscent Wolf. Once I realized that A3 was so strong, I went looking for other blood generation, and nature provides. So Bloodscent Wolf is a beast, it provides blood, checks a bunch of boxes. The body leaves something to be desired, but I really do like this card from way back when. I still like it here. Don't be afraid to pitch this to Pagan Harvest, where you're paying 2 to get 3 blood instead of 3 to get a weak body and 1 blood. It's really not that big a deal, and you'd rather feed it in. So if you can't hit it on curve, keep that in mind. Next up is a card that we've talked about before, and that's Druid Ruins. I really like this one. I mentioned in the Embers build, there's a lot more nature minions in this right now, and there could be even more. So you're going to get more, just more and more out of this, and your opponent has yet another thing that they have to contend with. Even if you have to curve, it's a really clunky curve, into a 2-drop the next turn, obviously curve doesn't apply, you still get a 3/3 Swamp Scout or a 2/3 Owl, which could mean that it lives through things that your opponent was banking on being able to remove it, or just requiring a little bit more effort, and you can drain those resources from your opponent. Will it make the long-term cut? I think it could. I could certainly see an argument for cutting it. It is a tempo loss, again, a terrible top deck, but you have a bunch of card draw in the form of these conjure effects and Owl. It really depends on which other pieces you move or remove entirely. And that's what it'll come down to. Feast or Famine, we talked about a lot. I love it. It's a fantastic, very efficient removal card. 5 is a pretty good number in this game to be able to take out a lot of things or keep your own guys alive. Most of the time you're hitting Famine, but a turn where you can go Famine that, oh, and A3 that, while you still have a board, you're feeling pretty good about that. Next up is Island Turtle. We talked about it a little bit before. It's also a beast. It allows you to continue with gas, continue applying pressure, or just throw things out there, because ultimately you're not too concerned with the Island Turtle body once it's on the board. It almost is a negative because it clogs up your side of the board. But getting Earthen, even though they're not beasts, we'll make an exception here, most of them are pretty solid. It was not uncommon that I take Awakened Earth or any of the other high-end ones that suddenly said, all right, well, I got a big finisher. Stop me. That sort of thing. So we talked about the Blitz package. Let's talk about Beast Mistress, who kind of rounds out the minion portion of the card draw. There's still a little bit more. The +2/+2 was very significant. You can turn some very mediocre or even bad beasts into pretty bonkers ones when they're suddenly way undercosted for what they provide, either stat-wise, effect-wise, or the combination of both. I really like Beast Mistress. It's just clunky because of the 5 cost. As I mentioned earlier, I'm torn between them and the Swamp Scouts. I could see cutting one or the other and having a max set of whatever one stays. I got to play around with it more. If you have the availability, try it out, see if you like it. But I could see this or some of the other card draw elements shifting over time. Talked about the Beast. Here's a card that I would love to get more copies of, maybe in that Beast Mistress slot, and that's Spirit of the Hunt. Because of the evade, you can slap this down and soak an attack from anything that doesn't have speed. The Seek, and this is why you may want to rework some of the cards in this deck to ensure that there's actually a higher native beast count, was generally going off, to be perfectly honest. Like, it was okay. Getting it more than twice makes it pretty wild. Like, this thing is now an 8-9. That's a pretty big body, and it would continue to heal, quote unquote, if you saw more beasts. And remember, if you have an owl out, you might even get the seek trigger at the end of your turn. So just keep that in mind. If you can, given the small deck size in Runestrike, it's much simpler to try and calculate, well, this is how many beasts I have left. All right, I have such and such a chance to hit it off of this owl or next turn, and then try and calculate it out. Often you're just kind of playing it on curve and then going, well, when I get it, I get it. But it is something to keep in mind as you're playing it. I'd like more copies of it. It's obviously also itself a beast, so that way it includes it is included in the higher beast count. I don't think I need to say much about Twister. You probably get it. The last thing in the deck, though, is Gaia's Blessing, and I do have some things to say about this. Add 3 random runes to your hand. Restore health equal to each rune's mana cost. This gets weird because there are times where, as I mentioned, your hand could be clogged, and then you're staring at this Gaia's Blessing and go, I can't play this. I'm only going to get 1 card off of it. And if that's like a 2-drop, that sucks. But there are definitely games where it's, okay, well, I'm hitting everything on curve, on curve, on curve, on curve. Oh, it's turn 7. I only have 4 cards in hand. I'll draw 3, add random, and then heal a bunch, which I've had opponents play it against me. I've done it where most of the time you're healing minimum double digits. Obviously, you could low roll and then end up with like 1-drop, 2-drop, 2-drop, or something like that. Or you could high roll and hit 3 10-drops, and then you heal a ton, but you get to play them out slowly. Regardless, you can generally find value in what you're doing. It's a draw 3. There are few enough cards in this game that are so bad that you are unhappy to get them for quote-unquote free off of something like Gaia's Blessing. Most of the time, at worst, it's, okay, I got another body. It's a threat my opponent has to honor, even if it's not the most ideal or most powerful thing I could have. It's generally good enough. Will this stay? In light of the fact that A1 got reworked from the last patch, I could definitely see that being the case, that this needs to stay so you have some sort of healing. It will ultimately rely and depend on whether you rework other parts of the deck. So that's the general, or well, not the general, but the specific breakdown of each of the cards. Now let's jump into some general thoughts about the build. So overall, I had intended this to kind of be a mid-rangey, aggro control-y build, and it basically worked out that way. You don't have a spectacular top end. You are not going to draw the game out to turn 35 and then bludgeon your opponent with ridiculous legendaries or things like that. I mean, you could. You have enough draw randoms or conjure randoms to possibly do that. You also don't have a hyper-aggressive early game. But you do have some to pressure, and that's the key, and I mentioned this in other decks. Overall in Runestrike, you need to make sure that you're constantly applying pressure, because between the champion strikes, both from your opponent and from your own champion, you're going to have to make sure that you're closing the game out before your opponent, and not necessarily in an aggro way. This deck has some pretty decent-sized minions that could certainly require 2-for-1s, especially if the Druid Ruins manage to buff anything up. But realistically, a lot of them are just drawing you more stuff, and as mentioned, you're relying on your A3 or your other blood abilities in order to generate both card advantage, board advantage, and ultimately a win. I think that there's something viable here. We could include the Dianas, which we'll talk about in the next section. We could include the Beast Clan Lairds, which we'll talk about also. I'm not sure that they're absolutely necessary. Well, they're not absolutely necessary if your goal is to get to Diamond. You can definitely do it without. If you want to continue to compete, I think that you might struggle against heavier control decks. They're going to be able to go over the top. If they can heal a lot, your clocks sometimes can be lacking. Even against aggro, you end up kind of falling behind. You don't have a whole lot of life gain. If they pressure or are able to put out just more damage than you, well, you're going to lose. You can't just block forever. You have to turn the tables and be able to go face. That's why things such as our friend Spirit of the Hunt here are crucial, because they're big enough and sizable enough to avoid a lot of removal as well as provide a significant clock. Your opponent has to care about them. Something like Swamp Scout or Island Turtle, your opponent may not have to care, to be perfectly honest. They can just ignore it, go in another lane, and be like, oh, I dropped an enormous dragon. Oh, I have 60,000 undead. Oh, I'm just gonna do Ogma things. And that can be a problem. I do really enjoy this, and I think there are improvements, so let's talk about the cards that could help this deck out. As mentioned, we have to talk about things like Beast Clan Laird, and I think that this guy's actually pretty important to the deck if you want to compete at the higher levels. Having not actually played it, as you can see, I don't even own it. This is all speculation. The body itself is kind of bad. You're not really, I don't think you can expect that it's ever going to actually live to grow unless you're already winning. However, you could build up a lower curve or create a lower curve in the list and then play the Beast Clan Laird towards the top to ensure that you're winning a bunch of combats. That's where maybe the Mastodons come in, possibly instead of Druid Ruins, and things like that, so that you can be higher velocity and be just kind of a thicker, chunkier, more aggressive, not quite aggro deck. As I said, I don't think it's really going to grow. Clearly, they aren't necessary. I specifically wanted to try something else. I think they'd still be worth it, and I'm looking forward to actually acquiring them. Now, Diana's another card that I don't actually own. Normally, I've been trying to avoid legendaries, but this one, there's a couple things I want to say. One, it kind of annoys me that if I search for Beast, it doesn't pull up Diana, so I constantly forget that this card exists. So part of it's I got to remember. But it is actually pretty important. The body's a little undersized for the mana cost, but it does allow you to potentially flood the board the next turn. And if you were filling your hand early on via Swamp Scout, via, I mean, it would come down on the same turn, but Beast Mistress or any of these other effects, Island Turtle, you could have a fistful of beasts that could just get vomited onto the board. Well, Island Turtle doesn't really help there unless it's another Island Turtle, but you get where I'm going with it. You could definitely end up just plopping your hand on the board. Oh, your opponent went first, so they cleared your board with Twister or something. All right, well, Diana allows you to just completely rebuild. I mentioned earlier Bloodbane, and of course there's a whole litany of other beasts that could possibly be included, from Mastodon to Tomb Viper to a number of other things, but I'm actually going to go outside the theme here and talk about Doom Knight. There has been a recent resurgence, or maybe just in general surge, of Dauntless, and they primarily focus on A3. It's a deck that I actually want to build and talk about in the near future, but it's a deck that relies on generating a ton of blood and then activating the Dawn A3 for, well, fun and profit for them, not so much for you on the receiving end. Doom Knight can mess with that, but it can also obviously mess with a number of other decks. While it doesn't feature the Beast tag, it's a little bit off theme. Some cards are just powerful enough to justify it, and I think that this might be something to look at. It comes out a little bit late for most of the things that you want to do. Obviously, at 5 blood, Dawn's going to activate A3 2 turns before this even happens. They may not even necessarily have a problem getting to the blood cost due to the various blood generators before then, but you got to take what you can get. I think there's a number of different things that could be added to this deck, so let me know down in the comments if you've been running a Beast deck and what your build looks like. So that does it for the Keeper list. It's something that I definitely want to revisit because I think there are other ways to take Keeper, but I really enjoyed exploring the idea of a Beast-centric tribal deck, and I think there's a lot there and more that can be unlocked power-wise from this particular archetype. But as I mentioned at the end of Doom Knight, let me know if you've been running a Beast deck down in the comments and what it looks like. Any suggestions, anything I missed, anything I glossed over. I'm really excited to continue playing Keeper, but that'll do it for this time. So as always, everybody, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and Black Lives Matter.